The biggest change that comes into your life when something like this happens, and I became leader of the Labour Party after John Smith, my predecessor, died suddenly, is just that you become a big public figure, and that obviously changes your life and the life of your family pretty enormously. So that's the main impact that you feel as a person, is just the difference in your family and family life. When did you first interested in university? I'd always been interested in current affairs, but I became particularly interested at university and became interested in political ideas there. I wasn't particularly a student activist, and then joined the Labour Party after I left university.
Where'd you grow up?
In County Durham, which is where my constituency is now. And we lived just in Durham City itself. It's a beautiful part of the north of England. And I lived there until I went away to university.
Our viewers...
It is the toughest part of doing the job in terms of the sort of strain and performance. And I think it's probably the same for the Prime Minister as well, but you prepare for it, obviously you have to decide what the topic of the day is that you're going to go on. And then I'm only allowed to ask questions. I can't actually make statements, or not strictly. So you've then got to plot out where in your subsequent questions you think the Prime Minister is going to go. So it's a bit of a charade in a way, but I'm amazed wherever I go around the world, whether it's Japan, the United States, the rest of Europe, people seem to watch it. It's probably better fun watching it than it is taking part.
Have you ever...
Yeah, a few times. You know, I mean, sometimes either he gives a very good answer or it's an answer you don't expect. I mean, sometimes it can be difficult if you get up and say, why aren't you doing such and such? And he says, okay, I will, you know. You're left wondering what the next question is. But normally we manage to get it about right.
What is the relationship?
I mean, this obviously, the din of political battle is never far absent, but it's important that you have a relationship outside of that too, and that you can discuss things if they're in the interest of the country and questions of importance. And for example, recently when we had the tragedy over Dunblane, you know, with those appalling mass murder of those children in Dunblane in Scotland, I mean, we went there together, we did that together, and you know, there are things that you do in common as well as things that you know, obviously completely antagonistic towards each other in respect of politics.
We're here.
It's to describe a process of change the Labour Party's undergone. It's rewritten its constitution, transformed its policy making and its membership, with the idea of getting the Labour Party back to mainstream majority values in British politics and allowing us to lead the forces of political change in a way that is gathering support from all parts of the community and isn't dependent on simply some of the traditional areas of support.
Is there any comparison to what the Labour Party is doing in Britain and what the Democratic Party is doing in this country?
Yes, there has been some similarity, because both of us have gone through the same process of change. You know, we were the people that created government, we were very closely associated with the trade unions, but you know, these relationships have to develop over time. I mean, the values remain the same, but you've got to strip away any of the outdated baggage that clings onto you. And it's been important that we've put our relationship with the trade unions on a more secure footing, that we've made changes that have allowed us to be a more relevant party.
Are there...
The United States, and you know, we were brought up with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and in more recent times, Roosevelt and Truman. And there's a very close association between Britain and America, and for anyone that's interested in British politics, you like to look at American politics too.
What about
I don't know there's anyone I would particularly pick out as a mentor, but I think in our history the Attlee government in 1945 was obviously a very significant government, and many of the people that were active in that are sort of great figures of Labour history, like Ernie Bevan, Nye Bevan, and in my own generation, of course, we've undergone a considerable period of change as well.
What is the...
Well, I wish I knew that. I mean, if I did, I'd be down at the bookmakers, but I think it's certainly going to come in the early part of next year. It may come sooner than that. With the by-election victory we had last night, the majority being reduced to one, you know, it's obviously a situation of some difficulty for the government, and at the moment, at any rate, there's a lot of momentum behind us, but we don't take anything for granted. Polls can change, as you know.
If you were to become Britain's Prime Minister, what kind of a leader would you want to be?
I think I would want to give the country a clear sense of direction and purpose, and strong leadership, because I think that's what the country wants and needs. You know, we face huge problems in both our countries, the United States and here, problems of economic insecurity, of social breakdown, and we require some very clear and firm directions for our country in order to heal some of these wounds.
Will those issues decide the election?
Yes, I think so, to a large measure, yes, I do believe that.
As you know, cameras are...
Well, it's a few years now, but it's only a few years. And there was a huge controversy about it as to whether they would make Parliament worse or better. I think there are still open views about that. But Prime Minister's Questions has become a great sort of spectacle, as I say, virtually around the world. I sometimes wonder how much good it does politics, but that's another matter. As a spectacle, it's certainly there.
You think they've changed the way you do your job?
I think so, yes. They've made you more aware of the need to get across a very clear and strong message straight away. But I don't, you know, Parliament, I mean, people talk about Parliament being very rowdy. It's a very live debating atmosphere. And necessarily because it's live, and it really is live, I don't just mean it, you know, you don't get up and just read into the record what your speech is. It's a real debating chamber. And that gives it its problems, but it also gives it some enormous strengths.
If I can take just one more minute.
You really manage the party as well. The party organisationally, we've got our own secretary who looks after the party. I mean, I'm obviously closely involved in that. We are having to respond in Parliament the entire time. And of course, you're trying to lead a political movement as well, make speeches and policy papers and so forth on the issues of the day. So, I mean, it's like being the head of a very large organisation.
You have 3 children?
I do.
And their ages?
12, 10 and 8.
Do you talk politics at the dinner table?
Not much, actually, quite honestly. Once I get home at night, I think I've had about enough of it.
How do you relate?
I play a lot of sport. I play tennis and swim and take some exercise. And I'm still a fan of rock music and listen to that, and some classical music too. I like to get out to the theatre. I think it's important in politics to have a life outside politics. Otherwise you become a bit dull and a bit remote from the experience of most ordinary people.
What kind of musicians do you like?
Oh, I'm sort of into the rock music scene, really. I mean, I like all the, you know, there's Simply Red and Sting and Guns N' Roses even, you know, all the normal ones. But I think it's important, too, to keep abreast of what's happening. We've got a very resurgent pop music industry in Britain at the minute.
Toни Blер.
I'll just explain very briefly that I think there were really 3 elements that were critical to this visit. The first is to explain today's Labour Party, New Labour, to say both where we have come from and where we are going for the future. Secondly, to address the business community in the United States of America, in particular, obviously, in New York. And I met with various people who were part of the banking community, the financial community in Wall Street, but also gave a speech yesterday at the British American Chambers of Commerce, where I talked about an incoming Labour government's economic policy and how we would cope with some of the critical economic issues that our country faces. And of course, it was also extremely important, thirdly, to establish a relationship with the administration here. And I'm delighted at the way that that has gone. In my meeting with the President, we touched on a number of different issues. Northern Ireland, of course, Bosnia, and amongst other things, the problems faced by all modern governments as to how to cope with the huge insecurity, economic insecurity, caused by the rapid pace of technological and global change in the world. And I hope it has been a successful visit. I have certainly enjoyed it enormously and had the benefit of discussing with a wide range of people, indeed including Secretary Rubin of the Treasury and also, of course, Dr. Greenspan of the Federal Reserve Board. So it has been a very wide-ranging set of discussions. And as I say, I've found it immensely helpful and worthwhile. Now, I think we're getting interrupted by the chimes. Is that for me, or is it just the time?
It's an honor of you. Your own time. Now an afternoon is maker.
Right. Questions, please.
Yes. And please identify yourself. Yes, sir.
An election or a referendum, as we've said on many occasions, is an open question. But I think the political consent of the people will be necessary. It is not necessary at this point in time to determine which of those is appropriate, but it must be done with the consent of the people. I don't believe that anyone thinks that such a step of change could be taken unless there was a clear indication of political consent.
What other way is it? It's not the referendum to
Well, of course, there is a general election, but we don't know whether it would be an issue at the general election, which is why the issue of the referendum is obviously extremely important too.
Robert Paston.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Carl Hartman's next, and then you, sir, and then this gentleman over here.
Carl Hartman, Associated Press. Get away from the economics for just a moment. Are you and the Labour Party committed to a Bill of Rights in Britain, and if so, in what form?
We are committed to the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights, because that is a convention to which we are a signatory, and indeed you can take cases to the European Court of Human Rights under that convention. What you cannot do is pursue that convention as a matter of British law. Now, most other countries in Europe who are signatories to the convention have incorporated it into their law as well, so we would do that too. Well, there's no formal procedure, if that is what you mean, but of course, I think there is a very lively interchange of views on both sides of the Atlantic, and many of the problems that we face are the same. I mean, when I pick up and read any of the American press here, then I find precisely the same issues of both economic and, in a sense, social insecurity being discussed. And many of the solutions are the same. And the article by Felix Roten in the Wall Street Journal yesterday was an indication, I think, of the way that these arguments are developing. And in particular, there is a degree of common belief from people of both centre and centre-left positions that it is important in the modern world that we are trying to equip our people for this economic change, that we're not simply letting it happen. We cannot resist it or stop it. The globalization force will continue, but we are going to be able to cope with it much better if we're putting our people and our business in the position where they're able to succeed in these new competitive and global markets. Now, these problems are exactly the same on both sides of the Atlantic, and the discussions that we have had are obviously important. This was a conversation, indeed, where I was picking up on the conversation that I had with the President last November. I think the important thing is to realize that the values and principles that underpin both the Democratic Party here and indeed the British Labour Party, those values and principles will continue throughout time, but they have to be applied in different circumstances today. And it is a different world in which we live. And it's no disrespect to the legacy of FDR or the New Deal to say we have a different type of world today, just as the same, in the same sense. It is no disrespect to what was a great and radical reforming Labour government in 1945 to say the world is different and there will be different solutions. But the objectives are still the same, how we extend opportunity throughout our society and how we do it on the basis of where prosperity is not limited to a few, to an elite at the top, but is extended throughout our society. And that's why I say today that the British Labour Party is the true one-nation party of British politics, and that believes in the concept of a strong and cohesive society, a decent society backing up the individual. But the way that will happen will be different, and I suspect in 50 years' time it will be different again. And there will be a new group of modernisers that have come along and said, you don't want to listen to what they were saying back in that late 20th century. There's a different way of doing it. That is progress. And those political parties that want to succeed have to recognise the difference between learning from the past and living in it.